Hey guys, thanks for tuning in. If you're new, welcome. And if you're returning, welcome back. This video will be a bit different. This is a replay of a recent tournament match I played. This was a 45-person digital Lorcana tournament run on Tabletop Simulator. The tournament was run by Lorcana HQ. Go check out their Discord if you want to learn more. So in this match, you'll see me playing an earlier version of my Amethyst Ruby control deck in a best of 3 match versus Franz. He will be piloting his Amethyst Emerald hybrid aggro deck. This video aims to break down some high-level Lorcana in a great tournament match, and I'll be providing some commentary throughout that will hopefully be useful to anyone wanting to play Lorcana. And I think this video is especially helpful at understanding the nuances of a control versus aggro deck matchup. And I think it's useful for understanding what goes into playing a best of 3 and how to react to your opponent's deck with any sort of deck of your own. Before we dive in, please give the following people a follow or subscription or all of the above. I'll leave links in the description below to everyone involved. We have Franz from Tavern. He's my opponent in the match and a great player, so go give Tavern a follow. And we have B Squared and Jeilanin, who you will hear throughout the video hosting and commentating the games. Please give them a follow as well. Again, all of the links will be below. And finally, a big thanks to Lorcana HQ for running this tournament event. I recommend their Discord and their website to any Lorcana fans. All right, with that, let's dive into the matches. I'll be playing the main broadcast audio plus a recording from my POV. And so I'm going to be chiming in occasionally with a voiceover just like this to explain some more in-depth decision-making that I was thinking as we played. Enjoy.
Welcome everyone to the Lorcana HQ semi-final constructed tournament. We have a super exciting evening tonight. We have Steadfast versus Franz from Tavern. I am B224, also known as Brandon, and with me is my amazing co-host Jeilanin. Jeilanin, say hi.
Hey everyone. Just a little bit of background. We know Franz is kind of playing his Amethyst Emerald aggro deck, whereas Steadfast is running a control deck that's Amethyst Ruby that I'm sure a lot of people have kind of gotten to know. And so it'll be definitely an interesting matchup to see if in this game Franz can kind of outpace and pressure the control player, or does Steadfast as a control player, is he able to stabilize the early game in order to get into his late game win conditions?
Yeah, while we wait on the mulligans, I didn't see who was supposed to go first. While we wait on the mulligans, I want to review some of the decks real quick.
All right, so for my first mulligan here, I knew going in that Franz was running some lore-aggressive Emerald characters like Flynn Rider, Hans, and Cusco. So I keep anti-aggro tools like Befuddle and Be Prepared, as well as 2 Maui, who can rush right in after opposing character's quest. And as a quick reminder, it's probably obvious, but as I'm playing, I can't see Franz's cards in his hand, but I did put his hand from the broadcast up at the top of the screen, and so you'll be able to see the cards in his hand as well as my own throughout the match. But I do know Franz's deck list, and because I know I'm up against a strong mid-game deck, my strategy is to ink up every turn towards Be Prepared while mitigating the early effectiveness of his Emerald cards.
We've seen a lot of control in these games. We've seen a lot of Ruby, a lot of Amethyst, and a lot of Sapphire. And so I think it's really fun to see Franz running the Emerald Amethyst deck that basically just does what Emerald is good at disrupting the opponent, making it really difficult for them to make decisions, but we're not going to go too deep. We see the game is starting. It looks like Steadfast inks Aladdin Heroic Outlaw, and he is going to play out a Shield of Virtue. And for those of you that don't know, the Shield of Virtue lets you ready another character for 3 ink, and they can't quest for the rest of the turn, but that's really that's a great card for Steadfast, especially with those Aladdin Heroic Outlaws, whom we can see when Aladdin Heroic Outlaw challenges. If he banishes something, the opponents lose 2 lore and he gains 2 lore. So we see that as an early play. Franz has a pretty aggressive deck with playing a couple 2-drops like Flynn Rider. And I only see Flynn Rider in his hand right now, but he runs a couple other 2-drops. So maybe we can see Franz get out pretty early.
Yeah, it is notable that Franz did not have a one drop in this game. I'll need to go check to see if he does run any one drops, but potentially not playing something on turn one may have slowed him down a little bit. It will be interesting to see from Steadfast's perspective how useful the Shield of Virtue is going to be. I see that he has two Mauis in hand, which essentially the shield might allow those Mauis to attack multiple times, which can make a huge difference. We just saw Steadfast play the Befuddled. It's a card that essentially lets you return any two cost or one cost card on either side of the field back into their owner's hand. And so we just saw him befuddle the Flynn Rider back into Franz's hand. Now it doesn't really kind of remove Flynn Rider. Franz can always play back the Flynn Rider, but the whole point of befuddled is to slow down your opponents. And so now we can see it's turn four. Steadfast already has 4 ink, and Franz only has a Maleficent on board with zero lore currently. And he is finally on the board with 1 lore. So we definitely see that kind of going first for Steadfast, as well as playing just some befuddles, has really kind of slowed down kind of the pace of an aggro deck.
So you can see here that I decide to ink Friends on the other side instead of Maui or Befuddle. I wanted to keep my second Befuddle here to use on his Flynn Rider again because I know it's in his hand. I also want Maui to deal with Hatter and especially Cusco. However, inking Friends means I give away my 1 card draw tool, and this comes back to bite me soon.
So we'll see how it continues to develop as now we see that Maui come down, and Maui is going to provide a lot of good kind of control to help stabilize the board. Maui itself can't quest. It has 0 lore to quest with. However, Maui does have rush, which means that the moment he comes down, he can attack. And he has a lot of attack for a character. He has 6 attack and 5 health. As I zoom in, and you can kind of take a look at the cards in Steadfast's hand. So we know that Steadfast definitely has a lot of kind of the ability to handle Franz's board right now. And we just saw the second Maui come down to take out that Flynn Rider. And Steadfast needed to discard a card because he attacked into the Flynn Rider. And so he discarded the Rafiki, which now isn't going to be super relevant because Rafiki is really good on turn 3. Once you hit like turn 5 or higher, you got other answers. You got your Dragonfires, you got your Be Prepareds. So I think the main question now is can Steadfast get into his card draw, because he is going to run out of gas pretty soon. And so he really needs to find those magic mirrors that he runs in his deck.
Yeah, I have to highlight something that we saw just a second ago. We saw a Maui come down, and then Franz responded by playing a Zeus, which has Rush, meaning he can challenge the turn that he's played, and Challenger +4, which just means when he's challenging, he gets an extra 4 strength. And I've been loving seeing this tech by Franz. We see so many people play Rafiki for things like this to get rid of characters because Rafiki's 1 less ink. He's a 3/3, so if he gets traded back into, he's still doing 3 damage. But Zeus is a great tech for cards like Maui, and obviously Steadfast isn't playing a card like Cusco, but another great tech into Cusco. Zeus does that 4 strength, which sometimes is just enough to get what you need to. But just like you mentioned, Steadfast is running really low on cards right now, and right now, Franz is doing great in cards. He basically has a full hand. I know that Franz is going to be counting the Be Prepareds coming out of Steadfast's hand. For those that don't know, both players have each other's deck lists now that they're in top 8, so each player should be aware of what each other player is running. To be honest, they each probably have it pulled up right now. And
so I have a difficult decision to make here. I have 6 in my inkwell with Be Prepared in hand, and I'm starting to feel the pressure. So knowing Franz can potentially play Cusco plus Flynn next turn means I have to be able to throw down my wipe if needed. And so finally I use Friends of Greed to draw 2 cards, hoping to find something other than Aladdin to ink, because I'd love to play him down as a threat.
We're going to pull up the Cusco card real quick, because I think this is a very key card to Franz's deck. Franz is trying to go faster than Steadfast is. And Cusco is a card that has Ward, which means he cannot be chosen by an opponent's ability. So a card like Dragonfire that lets you choose a card and banish it can't choose Cusco. Any Maleficent Monstrous Dragon can't choose Cusco to banish it. The only cards available to Steadfast to take care of this Cusco is the Be Prepared. And Steadfast runs 4 of them, but he also knows that Franz is running 4 Cuscos. So if Franz can put out enough stuff onto the board, which we see he has a lot of stuff in his hand, and Steadfast stays at a low hand and is running out of answers, then he's going to be forced to play some of these Be Prepareds. And the moment that Steadfast runs out of Be Prepareds or gets low on Be Prepareds, I'm sure we'll see Franz putting down some of those Cuscos, trying to race his way up to 20, because that's going to be really difficult for Steadfast to work with.
Yup. And I was just about to say, we see the Ursula's Cauldron come down from Steadfast. That's gonna be definitely a annoying card. Nothing Franz can do about it. Essentially, that Ursula's Cauldron lets Steadfast filter the top 2 cards of his deck and put 1 on the top and 1 on the bottom, just helping Steadfast get to the exact cards that he needs. And it's not, while it provides a different kind of value than Magic Mirror that lets you just draw 1 into your hand. The Cauldron really does a lot of good work, especially early on when you don't have as much ink to play with. And so what we'll kind of continue to see is every single turn on Steadfast, he's going to use that Ursula's Cauldron, take a look at the top 2 cards of his deck, and then choose which one he wants to draw next, right? And so if any of our viewers are kind of wondering why kind of that is happening every single turn, essentially it just allows the control player to get better draws there. The notable thing is neither player's deck runs any steel cards. It's a different color, and so because there's no item removal, we're definitely going to see that the items that Steadfast plays are going to stick around and just continue to provide more and more value as the game goes on.
So my biggest decision to make from this point on is when to play Be Prepared. Brandon mentioned this earlier, but the matchup is a tug of war between my 4 Be Prepareds and Franz's 4 Cuscos. If I'm forced to play Be Prepared before any Cuscos come out, the game shifts out of my favor heavily, especially since I will likely already be pretty far behind in lore. Both of these decks run Amethyst with card draw packages, so the ability to draw into our big tools is fairly matched, so that's not an advantage I can lean on too much in this matchup. And so here I'm at least considering playing Be Prepared because he has 2 strong questing characters plus Elsa on board. I'm having to do a bit of projection and math. He's at 9 ink and could potentially quest for another 7 next turn with an Elsa shift, putting him at a dangerous 16 lore. However, I knew that Franz's deck doesn't run the Floodborn Elsa in the list, and so at most he could threaten 5 next turn going to 14. So that knowledge gives me a bit more wiggle room, and I know that I'm safe for now. In addition, I only have 1 Be Prepared in hand, and I haven't seen Cusco yet. So I decide that holding it is worth the risk. I'm now putting the burden on Franz to decide the next move, but he's definitely in control of the game at this point. You'll see this back and forth unfold a bit more in the next few turns, including a blunder where I overlook that obviously free banish on Zeus with Maleficent. But oh well. As they say, hindsight is 20 lore.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. These values from these Ruby Amethyst players can be really scary because if he starts getting an Ursula's Cauldron down and he gets a Magic Mirror down, I mean, we already saw the combo last turn where he looked at the top 2 cards. They both ended up being a befuddle, so it wasn't anything crazy, but he knew which card was on top. And then afterwards he played Maleficent Sorceress, so now he has a character on board. And then he draws the card that he knows is on top, so he can filter and he can get stuff into hand as quickly as possible. And as we can see, Steadfast is building up ink ink very quickly. He already has 8 ink into his inkwell, 1 more ink, and he'll have options for Maleficence and things like that. So the more items that we see come down, the more difficult it's going to be for Franz to do things. We see the White Rabbit's pocket watch come down, which is scary as well, because that basically means that Steadfast will be able to play a character and then immediately challenge with it most turns. But at the same time, honestly, there's a lot of countering going on that I'd like to highlight. So we talked about the shield earlier, about how great it is because it lets you ready your characters. And so that's great for Steadfast because he can attack into he can challenge into one of Franz's characters, banishing it, and then he can ready that character back up so that Franz can't respond. But then we see Franz play the Elsa, and I'm going to pull that up on stream as well. Elsa Snow Queen. If you exert Elsa Snow Queen, you can exert an opposing character. So now the characters that Steadfast readies back up, Franz can use Elsa to exert those characters and get rid of them if he wants to. And then we see another layer of counter through the White Rabbit's pocket watch, because now Steadfast is able to just play things and challenge with them immediately. So the Elsa becomes a little bit less useful because Steadfast can play something, and the turn he doesn't have to wait for its ink to dry to challenge. Franz won't have the ability to exert that Elsa and then get rid of it with a favorable trade with something like a Zeus or a Rafiki that can rush into it. So there's a lot of complexity going on in the game already, and it's really interesting. I really have to commend Franz for this deck, because a lot of times when people hear the term aggro deck, it's really easy to think, oh, they just play stuff and they turn it sideways and they race you to 20. And sometimes that is what happens. But the way Franz's deck is structured is very strategic, because we see a couple things like the Genie on the Job that can target things and bounce them when needed. But not only that, 2 things that I love, we see one of them in hand, is we see a John Silver, and there's also a there's also a Mother Gothel. So John Silver will give a character Reckless when he's played, and every time he quests, he gives another character Reckless, which we see this come down now, which is going to prevent Steadfast from being able to quest. It's also going to force Steadfast to exert stuff and challenge with stuff that he doesn't want to, so potentially taking unfavorable trades. And then if Franz can build up enough of a board presence without getting Be Prepared, he can play a Mother Gothel, and when Mother Gothel quests, that keeps the other opponent from questing at all while Mother Gothel is exerted. So we're really seeing the pressure being put on, and the Be Prepared comes down, which is exactly what I think Franz was trying to do. Flood the board, force the Be Prepared out of Steadfast, because we see 2 Cuscos in hand. He's intentionally not playing these Cuscos, trying to get those Be Prepareds out of there. That's one less Be Prepared that he has to worry about.
Yeah, definitely. It was also very interesting to note that Steadfast did not play Be Prepared one turn earlier when he had a chance to. And Franz had like 3 characters on the board. And one of the like interesting things, just kind of as a note to all the viewers, is when you're playing kind of the control deck and the matchup, it's really interesting about when you choose to use your Be Prepareds, or when you choose to kind of use your characters to attack into your opponent, because in some sense, how much lore your opponent has is actually kind of another resource, right? So for example, if you determine that an opponent isn't close to 20 yet, and you can essentially take a turn to build your board a little bit rather than have to play reactively, and just let your opponent get a little bit closer. So part of the skill in playing kind of control decks, or I guess Lorcana in general, is really understanding when you can kind of let up the gas a little, let your opponent quest, and kind of do some other things, and when that becomes too dangerous and you need to kind of answer your opponent. And so what we saw there was Franz putting enough pressure on that previous turn that Steadfast needed to run out a Be Prepared. And then Franz essentially immediately played out the Cusco, because essentially you're kind of taking the fact that, okay, opponent played 1 Be Prepared, they're not likely to have another in their hand. So now the Cusco is pretty safe to at least quest once for 3 lore. And as we see, Franz only needs 3 more lore now. All of a sudden he's at 17 lore, and he does have another Cusco in hand. So I think how I would kind of I would definitely give the advantage to Franz so far. And I think the fact that Steadfast has not been able to get out additional card draw in the form of his magic mirrors or friends on the other sides has really just made it a bit difficult for him to be able to deal with all of the cards that Franz is just throwing out to quest.
You can see here that I'm finally starting to come online, and I've been able to scout and draw my second Be Prepared, and I've just found Maleficent Dragon as well, and I have enough ink to play either if needed. But with 17 lore, Franz is likely too far ahead for me to deal with his pressure. It may be possible if I had another 2 or 3 cards in hand, but this game is not looking great for me.
Yeah, I really don't like the place that that Steadfast is in right now. Not only because he had an extra Cusco to play, so that means that Steadfast is essentially top decking right now. He has to see a Be Prepared this turn or he loses. But also the odds just aren't in his favor because he's already used to Be Prepared. So Franz has more Cuscos than Steadfast has Be Prepareds, which means in the very long game, Franz ends up winning the moment that he draws a Be Prepared. But I don't see an answer, so I think this is just going to be game one. Franz is going to take game one. And just like you said, I think the major issue was Steadfast couldn't find that draw. You know, he found 2 Be Prepareds, but if Ruby Amethyst isn't able to get through their cards quickly and find those answers, especially for a deck like Franz is playing, it's playing a lot of characters that have to be dealt with very quickly, you know, that just happens. Franz can go too fast.
So going into game 2, I knew I couldn't afford to run out of steam again. I had to keep and use any card draw to get me ahead so I can react to the pressure from Franz's deck. I can't be inking friends on the other side and other draw generations so liberally. I had to utilize those to gain card advantage and my removal power. Those are a couple of the vital things I'm thinking of during my opening hand and my mulligan decisions.
Yeah, definitely kind of after you get to, so essentially I would say the stages of the game for a control player is control early board, right? In order to get to kind of your Be Prepareds and Elsa's and all of that sort of stuff. But once you deal with kind of hyper aggro early board and get to the 7 ink, it's not over yet because by that time you're probably either running low on cards or have just a lot fewer resources to kind of play. And so you really need to kind of change up the game of, okay, how do I balance board wipes and kind of removal in the form of Dragonfires, Be Prepares, along with a card draw from the Magic Mirror. Because ideally, you always want to be drawing more cards than your opponents in order to kind of really get that margin, kind of get some breathing room. And so really like even at turn 8 or 9, you're still kind of catch up and struggle as a control player until you get to kind of those turn 10 and 11s where you can play a Be Prepared or an Elsa and draw a card. And that's when kind of the game starts snowballing in your favor. So really, the non-control player has quite a bit of time to try to kind of outmatch or put enough of a clock on the control player. Anyways, kind of going back to the game, once again we see no Flynn Riders from Franz this game. That might make a pretty big difference as Steadfast gets out some card draw from Maleficent and Gaston's, and Gaston's are amazing to deal with kind of Cruella's or any the board that Franz has right now because Gaston is so cheap. He's only 2 cost while he does not have rush, which means he can't attack the turn that he is played. Right now, we can definitely see Steadfast having a lot better draw than last game. He has the resources. The turn 4 is a little bit awkward because he doesn't have the Maui there. So I think it's either Steadfast is going to run out the Gaston or he's going to run out the Elsa. And honestly, I think both are kind of really solid plays and puts a lot of pressure on Franz, who has the Zeus, I guess, in his hand for the turn 4 play, or the Hans. And once again, that's kind of a toss-up. What do you think, Brandon? What would you play if you were Franz in this case? The Zeus to take out the Maleficent, or the Hans for questing?
It's definitely a hard choice. Honestly, right now I'm trying to go as fast as possible, so I'm probably playing out a Hans, keeping in mind that you're trying to get some of these be prepareds out of Steadfast, right? Like as the aggro player,
Yeah.
and knowing that Cusco's are a big win condition for you, if he has to use a be prepared in order to get rid of your board that doesn't have a Cusco on it, you're really happy about that. I was actually more scared of Steadfast playing the Gaston over the Elsa, mainly because in Amethyst and Ruby, there are a lot of cards that have an effect that happens when they enter play.
So at this point, there's a very tough decision to make. The easy play here is to tap Elsa and exhaust Hans and then play Maui and rush into him. And I thought for a moment about doing that. And if this same board state was in the previous game where I was playing from behind, it would have been an easy choice. But if you look at this game, I have a ton of great tools in my hand, including that Maui, and I'd like to hold off as long as I can. With all the cards in hand and with Franz at only 3 lore so far, I decided to instead use Elsa to sing friends on the other side to see even more options and set up the Gaston to take out Hans if needed. I'm only 2 turns away from Be Prepared, and Franz will be at 5 ink next turn. And so I feel safe enough to hold out a couple turns, and hopefully Franz will play a few more characters that I can take out, ideally Cusco. And I think tapping with Elsa and then playing Maui out to rush into Hans here, it could scare him off from feeling safe in playing more characters. And like I mentioned, he's only at 3 lore, and so I still have the luxury of delaying 1 turn, maybe 2 turns, before responding to the Hans. And as you'll see in a moment, it does work out because I get to take out a freshly spawned Mad Hatter after shifting in Elsa for the freeze.
And so in the board state that we saw, had a Gaston come out. For those of you that don't know, Cruella de Vil, when she's challenged and banished, the person whose Cruella that was, they get to choose a card to bounce back to hand. And so that would have been a really awkward place for Franz to be in with that Maleficent Sorcerer on board. Because as you were talking about earlier, early in the game, a control player isn't too worried about how much lore the opponent is questing, so long as they're not doing it at an extremely rapid rate. So Cruella only has 1 lore, and even with 2 on board, that's 2 lore a turn. You're really not too worried about that for a little while. You'll have a couple turns so you can catch up before you do anything. And if this Gaston runs into a Cruella and takes her out, if the only thing to pick is a Maleficent Sorceress, that's not a great thing to pick. You can choose not to pick something, which is probably what would have happened. But at that point, you just kind of wasted Cruella's ability. So I like the Hans play that we saw from Franz. He's really trying to put on some pressure. Yeah. We see the Mad Hatter come out, which adds up. This happens so quickly. There's 8 lore on Franz's side of the board now. So he's like, Go ahead, Jay.
I was about to say, I was surprised that Steadfast allowed the Hans to survive, because that previous turn he had a chance to use Elsa to tap down the Hans and play out his Maui to run it into the Hans. But I guess he opted for a little bit more additional pressure. I think so. This is one of those cases where we see Shift kind of coming into action. So Steadfast was able to shift Elsa onto the Elsa. So Shift essentially lets you play a card for a little bit less expensive. Normally Elsa costs 8 in order to play because he has such a good ability. Since Steadfast had small Elsa existing on board, it only costs 6 in order to shift the Elsa on, which allows Steadfast to tap down 2 of Franz's characters, which he used to tap down the Mad Hatter probably and the Hans. He took out the Mad Hatter, and the Franz will not be able to ready during Franz's next turn. And so it's just a really good tool to delay your opponent.
Yeah, and I love that play from Steadfast because I think essentially what he's doing is he's daring Franz to play more cards, right? Like you're tapping, or sorry, you're exerting something that can't be exerted the next turn. You're slowing him down. You're hoping Franz plays more cards, maybe even a Cusco if you're really lucky, because you're sitting on 2 of those Be Prepareds. You know you'll be able to play one of the Be Prepareds next turn. And then you can completely wipe Franz's board. Franz didn't have a ton of cards in hand at the time. We see he has 4 now. Oh yeah, and he's inking a card as well. So he has 3 cards in hand, which means he's going to have very minimal things to play out after you play this Be Prepared and completely wipe their board, which I think is a great place for a control player to be. You have a lot of answers in hand. You can start playing stuff out.
Yeah, I would actually think that Steadfast feels no pressure to play out the Be Prepared right now. He has a way to play out, say, the Maui to take out the Hans. He has an Elsa on board. I wonder if he wants to use the Elsa to run into a Cruella, which is probably gonna bounce the Elsa back. But like it feels a little bit awkward to play Be Prepared, especially when you have your own Elsa that can quest for 3, on the field. And so that's why we see kind of that Maui come down. I wonder, so either Steadfast is gonna quest with the Elsa or he's gonna attack into Cruella. So he does, and Cruella does bounce Elsa back. So it's essentially Franz is just saying, right now you only have 6 ink. Elsa takes 8 ink in order to play. And so it's still like gonna cost you a lot more in order to replay that Elsa. One mechanic that I want to point out for our viewers is when you shift onto your card, both cards are in the same pile. So wherever kind of that pile goes, both of the cards goes there. So for example, Cruella bounces the Elsa Spirit of Winter back into Steadfast's hand, but that also puts the smaller Elsa, 3-cost Elsa, back into his hand as well, which then Steadfast was able to ink. So that's just a mechanic that sometimes is a little bit confusing. So I wanted to point out to everyone viewing. Shifted cards or cards in that pile goes, if it goes into a discard, both cards goes into a discard. If a card goes into your hand, both cards go into your hand there.
Yeah, and that's just going back to the thing we talked about earlier, where a lot of cards that Steadfast plays, you're kind of okay with coming back to your hand to play again. Like Elsa is a really big thing to drop. It stalls Franz out a lot. She has a great stats and 3 lores. She's questing for a lot. So I know that definitely feels bad for Franz, but you obviously don't want to leave the Elsa on board to challenge or quest with anything either.
And so now, after all the dust has settled from all of those cards being played and traded, the board is clear on both sides. Franz has gained 12 lore over that course of events, and I've gained a handful of valuable cards. And depending on what Franz has in his hand, I think this is a great place to net out at for the control player, so I'm pretty happy with the game state currently. Ruby Amethyst is at its strongest in this position, an empty board, a full inkwell, and a handful of cards.
And now we definitely see this is a lot different of a story than before. Now we can see Steadfast has 7 ink with a lot of gassing hand. He has 2 Be Prepareds ready, and Elsa at 8 ink, and 2 Maleficents at 9 ink. So I would say right now that I would give the advantage definitely to Steadfast, even though Franz is at 12 lore and Steadfast is only at 3. It just feels like he is better able to deal with anything that Franz can throw at him currently. And especially now, like that Ursula's Cauldron is probably really nice to see. I'm sure Steadfast probably wanted a magic mirror there, but the Ursula's Cauldron can get you to that magic mirror faster, right? So right now I wonder how or if Steadfast is gonna deal with the Flynn Rider.
Yeah, we see him ink the Maui, which I was about to mention. He obviously can't challenge into Flynn right now because Flynn isn't exerted, but it looks like he's just going to play the Elsa and exert the Flynn Rider, which is perfectly fine. That's just delaying Franz even more. For those of you that don't know, Flynn makes it so that when you challenge into him, the opponent has to discard a card. So Steadfast has a pretty okay right hand right now, but you're never happy about discarding a card from hand, right? You want to have as many resources as possible.
Definitely, and that's what makes Flynn Rider so good at such a early play. Flynn Rider, like a lot of times, just makes your opponent have to make really tough and awkward choices, because your opponent can't really let Flynn keep on questing, but then they need to discard a card if they want to attack into him. So Flynn is definitely one of the staples of a good aggro deck.
And especially now that we see the Elsa Spirit of Winter on board, I like you mentioned earlier, because of that reason, until we see something like a Cusco come down, I'm sure that Steadfast doesn't want to play that those Be Prepareds and get rid of the Spirit of Winter. So I'm very eager to see it. We see the Hans come down, which is probably a larger target than the Flynn Rider is, but is there ever a world where Steadfast has to play Maleficent and banish the Flynn Rider instead of attacking it?
I mean, yeah, that's definitely a possibility. The other thing too, I'll also note, and I think honestly, I think we might see the Maleficent banish the Hans because it can quest for more lore. And I think Steadfast might be just okay discarding a card to kill the Flynn Rider. The one thing I want to know is sometimes what makes Magic Mirror so good and scary here is that you can sing Be Prepared with either a Maleficent Monsters Dragon or the Elsa. And by singing it, essentially you're freeing up 7 whole ink, and 4 of that can get you some additional card draw and so forth. And so I do think that like Be Prepared is going to come down sometime soon, but whether it comes down as a pay 7 in order to play it or be sung by a character could be really telling and interesting there. So we do see, okay, so finally oh, okay, interesting. Steadfast does kill that Flynn, discarding his Ursula's Cauldron.
And as much as it pains me to discard Cauldron here, I think it's the best move. I have an insane board right now with 2 other great cards in hand, and I'm beginning to threaten a win within a few turns. In this instance, I don't need the Cauldron to find anything else, and I'd much rather keep Franz at 15 lore after this turn, rather than letting him go to 17 by questing with Flynn.
But now you can see Steadfast rapidly gaining lore with that Elsa Spirit of Winter. It's questing for 3 a turn, and Franz's deck really doesn't do well kind of challenging into opponents, especially at 6 cost or the Elsa that has 6 health. So I think this is one of those cases where we'll see if the John Silvers may be able to delay Steadfast, because John Silver can give the Elsa Reckless, which means that he can't quest her. But for the time being, we're gonna see the Zeus come down. It won't attack because Franz is still gonna try to quest out. He's only 5 lore away. Whereas Steadfast, after questing for what, 8, 9? Sorry, 3, 5, 7, could be at 16. But Steadfast does up to take out the Yzma, and then has another Maleficent to take out the Zeus. I think, yeah, this game probably will go to Steadfast. There's just too much on board, and Franz doesn't have kind of the tools like a control player does to deal with a huge board state.
Yeah, and we can really see how drawing a bunch of cards as a control player really makes the difference. Steadfast sitting in a super great spot. He has 2 Be Prepareds in hand. So at most, he can deal with 2 Cuscos, which would be the scariest thing that he could see come down. Yeah, and it looks like Franz is just going to go next on that one. They're going to go to game 3. But it was like night and day between game 1 and game 2. So we see the power of drawing cards, and of Franz not getting those Cuscos, and of Steadfast being able to keep up and extend the game to those later games. And I mean, we saw it does not take very long for Steadfast to get stuff on board, like the Maleficent Monstrous Dragon. Lions and the Elsas that all are really big bodies, quest for a good amount of lore, and then in like 2 or 3 turns, he can just catch up to whatever the aggro player had gone to.
So my goal going into the final game is obviously a repeat of the success of game 2, a focus on building up into the late game in a way that allows me to be reactive. Franz's deck isn't being played quite as fast as I expected going into the best of 3, and so focusing on card draw and late game removal rather than stressing too hard on anti-aggro tactics in the early game seems to work in this matchup.
Definitely. I think one of the biggest differences in that game right there was just Steadfast being able to get to the friends on the other side. So magic mirrors aren't the only way to draw cards in the Amethyst Ruby package, right? You have the Queen, which can draw you cards. You also have friends on the other side, and just the normal 3-cost Maleficent there. And so out of all of those ways to draw cards, I think that first game, Steadfast was just a little bit unlucky in not getting a lot of kind of his draw going. But that second game, I think he used probably 2 friends on the other sides, and that really made a big difference. So both players are running Amethyst, so I do think that a huge kind of part of the game is seeing who gets to draw more cards from kind of the friends on the other side, the Maleficents and so forth there.
Yeah, we've seen, I'd have to check again, but I know at least 3 of the top 4 decks in this tournament had Amethyst in it, and that color is just extremely strong for the card draw, right? Like when you're drawing only 1 card a turn and you're having to put a card into your ink and then play a card, very quickly does your hand size come down. So Amethyst, there's draw in other inks, but Amethyst has the best cards that just say play this and draw a card. There's no stipulation. It doesn't have to be a character. You don't have to choose a specific card. You're not having to filter cards. And for that reason, we're seeing right now it's extremely strong, both in an aggro sense and in a control environment.
Mm-hmm. The one thing also to know is while I can't give enough praise for Gaston as a kind of tool for the Ruby player to kind of deal with aggro early game. I have to say though, a lot of times if an opponent is smart, they can bait out an attack from the Gaston because it does have reckless, which means that if Gaston can attack, he needs to attack. It's not like an option of you can hold him back for bigger threats or something like that. And so in that case, we saw Franz deliberately kind of exert Elsa and leave Elsa exerted as a target for Gaston, just because Elsa can only quest for 1, whereas his other characters like Zeus can quest for 2, and you'd much rather the Gaston run into an Elsa than it run into a Zeus. There.
Yeah, and we see Franz is not wasting any time getting stuff on board. He's playing the Zeus, didn't challenge with the Zeus because Zeus has 2 lore, and he plays the Cusco down, knowing that there's no way for Steadfast to play a Be Prepared for at least 2 more turns, especially because we don't see anything like a Shift Aladdin coming down. Be Prepared can't be played until turn 7 unless there's a way to sing it earlier. So unless Steadfast has a way to get rid of this Cusco through challenging, this Cusco is just going to be getting 3 lore for the next 2 or 3 turns, which is a lot of lore.
It's gonna be real fast.
Yeah,
it's gonna be real fast. But
so now that we are past the early game, we can see another typical game state between these 2 decks. Franz has found the fantastic turn 5 Cusco, and now on turn 6 he follows up with Hans. And even though it's only turn 6, he has 7 lore on the board, and with the potential to quest for 8 more, I have to respond here or it could be game over. Meanwhile, I have been able to find the cards I need through a few draw options, and I'm well equipped once I get to 7, 8, and 9 ink in my inkwell, but I have to make sure I can survive a few more turns to even get there. And as it stands right now, his board is looking very stacked.
We do see that Steadfast does have 2 Be Prepareds for next turn, so I think realistically what Steadfast is probably gonna do, I don't know if he's even gonna run out the Dragonfire this turn. Franz has 8 on board, which puts him to 15. So it's gonna be a choice, right? This is the tough decisions that Seth has faced. Do I let my opponent go up to 15 lore and then be prepared their entire board, or do I play out a Dragonfire and let my opponent go up to 12 lore? Um, and essentially, the cost of doing that is now you no longer have a Dragonfire in your hand for potentially the future when you might need it. Um, but at the same time, you're making your opponent be further away from their 20. Honestly, I think it could go either way. Maybe if he thinks that he has 2 Maleficent Monstrous Dragons, it might be enough single removal to justify playing out the Dragonfire. But no. Steadfast wants to keep the Dragonfire in his hand, and he feels like giving his opponent a 3 more lore is going to be worth having that Dragonfire as an extra card in his hand there.
So Jeilanin broke down this turn and my decisions perfectly. It was certainly a choice here to play Dragonfire or not, and I think it would have been the best play until I drew Aladdin, and then I decided to make that my plan. So playing Aladdin here, and then in a few turns later, I will end up playing him again. And I think those 2 plays with the Aladdins were some of my best moves I made during the best of 3. By reducing Franz by 1 lore, there's actually a huge difference between an opposing aggro deck going to 15 and going to 14. That 1 number can buy me at least 1 extra turn to deal with his board. But the Aladdin play also has potential to soak up even more pressure because it threatens a shift into Aladdin Heroic Outlaw, which would be devastating for the aggro deck. Now, of course, seeing my hand, you know that I don't have the big Aladdin, but to an opponent, this is a very threatening move because of the chance that I do have it in my hand of 6 cards. It's pretty likely. And as you'll see in a second here, the Aladdin does pull out a response with Mother Knows Best, which is an okay trade for both of us. Franz gets to quest after all, and I get to play Aladdin again for the lore removal, and again threaten a shift with the Floodborn Aladdin. The potential for this sort of unseen pressure is why I love piloting this control deck. I think it forces me to make complex decisions each game, and I think it's a testament to how well this game is designed and the tactical depth offered even within the first base set of Lorcana.
Yeah, and I kind of like this play after he drew the Aladdin Street Rat, just because like you're worried about them getting too close to 20, right? Because there comes a number in which there's stuff he can just play, and if you don't have an answer for it that turn or top deck it the next turn, which just means draw it next turn, then you lose. And so being able to play the Street Rat, reduce 1 lore, knowing that next turn you'll be able to play a Be Prepared, just makes Franz have to try a little bit harder to get there, to go for, instead of going to 15, going to 14. And sure enough, we immediately see something being inked and getting the Be Prepared off of the board. So now everything that Franz had built up is gone. He still has a decent ways to go. He has 6 lore that he has to get to. And we can see in Steadfast's hand, he has many, many, many cards that he can use to deal with everything. Basically, every card in his hand, except for the Aladdin Street Rat, is going to delay Franz from being able to do anything, because if we look at the Elsa Spirit of Winters, they can exert things, and so that they can't unexert the next turn, meaning they can't quest. We see 2 Maleficent Monstrous Dragons, which will just banish a character as soon as it comes onto the board. And if we see another Cusco, there's another Be Prepared in hand as well. So this might be the point in the game where Steadfast slowly starts to take control, and Franz just wasn't able to get out the gas fast enough.
Definitely. I wonder. Oh, so we see a Dragonfire there rather than playing out the Elsa. So interesting enough, and no ink from Steadfast.
So I decided to not ink here because I wanted to keep Aladdin in my hand. I recognized that Aladdin's ability to reduce lore plus put on the pressure from the potential shift was valuable. And next turn I can still play Be Prepared, or if I must play Elsa, I could decide to ink Aladdin then. The only reason why I'd want to ink him now is in case I thought I might need to play Dragon next turn, which would require me to ink during both turns.
So it means that he's still a at least 2 turns away from being able to play out the Maleficent Monstrous Dragon. But we see a Kuso come on board, which probably will draw out that second Be Prepared from Steadfast. And this is why it's always good to have a couple of Be Prepareds in your hand, just to deal with the Cuscos.
Yeah,
Or
definitely.
not. I'm actually surprised. Yeah, I
Oh,
guess I think Steadfast thinks that 16 his opponent being at 16 isn't going to be too much of an issue there. And I'm kind of inclined to agree with him. 16 is still pretty far away from 20, and now he Steadfast gets that little bit more value out of the Be Prepared, taking out 2 characters instead of 1 there. So
So I went with another Aladdin pressure play instead of dropping the Be Prepared immediately. I feel safe because of the Be Prepareds I still have to play, and I'm hoping Franz feels safe because I chose not to play them under such pressure from Cusco. Perhaps he suspects I haven't been able to find the Be Prepareds yet. My goal here was to kill off at least a second character with Be Prepared, and I managed to get Genie out before dropping the nuke. Keep in mind that Franz only has 3 cards in his hand, so he's also beginning to run short on resources, at least for now.
the interesting thing now is now Steadfast does not have any Be Prepareds, but because he has Elsa's, I think that's enough of a delay that it's gonna make it really difficult for Franz to quest out and get to that 20. It's so like some people may say annoying, but when you're playing against Control, sometimes you can be all the way up to like 16, 17, 18, even 19 lore, and you just can't get out that last lore. And so that's probably something we're gonna see something similar to this in this game.
yeah, and like these are the decisions that make a control player be a sub 50% win rate and above 50% win rate with the decks. I love seeing these Aladdin Street Rats coming out, Steadfast analyzing that exactly what you said, knowing there's not one single card that Franz can play that puts him in danger of winning the next turn. So he just draws out the Genie, gets rid of another thing with Be Prepared, giving it that much more value. And now, yeah, we're just sitting pretty. Like you're just the only thing you're worried about is another Cusco coming down. And even then, you have an extra turn to get something. And the more that Cusco doesn't come down, you get to play things like Elsa and Maleficent Monstrous Dragon to take things out. And so now we're seeing the part of the game where Steadfast, analyzing that 16 lore is a fine place for Franz to be at, he's starting to play his big characters out, and he's going to be able to start putting the pressure on Franz, saying like, if you don't find something to slow me down, I'm going to catch up really quickly.
And now the momentum has shifted a bit into my favor, and I'm prepared to respond to almost any threat with the cards in my hand. The one thing I am worried about is another Cusco that can avoid any targeted removal, and this is one reason why I'm keeping the small Aladdin in my hand. He can be played to reduce the lore and potentially buy me a turn to deal with the Cusco. Also, I wanted to point out that I will attack into both his Yzmas here, just like I did with the dragon, and I used the dice to mark 1 damage instead of 2 from Yzma. This was an oversight by me, but thankfully it doesn't impact the result of the game. Franz is able to trade his Zeus into dragon if desired, regardless of her willpower.
Yeah, and I think kind of on the flip side of things, we're also definitely seeing Franz not getting his card draw cards, like Friends on the Other Side or something. And so I think of the like kind of most notable things, it's like hand size does matter so much. Like in each of the kind of games where we saw a player become like comfortable or like has the advantage, look at how many cards they have in their hand. Right now, Steadfast has 7 cards in his hand. Franz only has 2. So I think that kind of like does a lot of explaining why Steadfast is in such a better, more advantageous position than Franz currently.
Yeah, and like Franz could not be in a worse place as an aggro player, and Steadfast could not be in a better place as a control player. As a control player, you'd love having multiple options in your hand. You don't want to be forced to use any particular thing if you don't want to. And Franz wants to have a lot of stuff in his hand so that he can very smart in a really smart way, play out the board so that you can force Steadfast to use certain things he may not want to. But only having, 2, 3 cards in your hand really limits your options. And you know that the way that Steadfast decks works with so much removal, you can't just throw everything out on board. And a lot of stuff that you do throw out on board is probably going to get taken away anyway. So Franz is sitting in a really difficult spot until he can find more card draw or maybe another Cusco. But even then, that's not going to get him to 20 where he needs to be.
Definitely, especially given that Steadfast has another Elsa on the way. Honestly, that second Elsa may just do it. But not only that, but he also has another Maleficent Monstrous Dragon there. And Franz really, like, even if Franz were at 19 lore, I think he still wouldn't have enough to get to the 20. It's just kind of that tough situation of the control player being able to set up everything and have all of the cards that they need in their hand there.
Yeah, and I don't want to speak like this game is over just yet, but if Steadfast is to win, I really think it came down to that decision of playing the Street Rat over, I think it was a Be Prepared that he had in hand.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it goes to show that like a lot of kind of these decisions have a lot of like impact a couple of turns down the road, right? And so kind of making like a play on turn 3 or turn 4 can really impact how the game goes on like turn 6 or 7. In this case, that was a little bit later. So like on turn 8 or something like that, Steadfast played the Aladdin Street Rat, choosing to save his Be Prepared and that sort of stuff, which essentially allowed him to kind of play the Be Prepared with additional value and have some other kind of cards in his hand in order to deal with what Franz may play. And so let's see what the board state is right now. Franz is at 17. Interesting. Okay. I don't know how Franz is at 17, but it seems like
he just quested with Cruella. That's how he got up to 17 from 16.
Got it. Was there a turn? Okay. So the Elsa like tap down effect already wore off. Interesting. I would have thought that Steadfast would have wanted to take out the Cruella before its effect wore off, but I think he ended up choosing to quest there. But I think actually Steadfast now is in a little bit of a pickle, right? I think he can take out the Cruella with the oh no, it'll be fine. He can take out the Cruella with,
and this is the end of the game right here, with victory going to me 2-1. I let Franz know that I had yet another dragon in my hand, and with his hand empty, we decided to call it there. All I needed to do was use the dragon to take out the Zeus that was threatening to quest for lethal. It's notable that Franz could have used that Zeus or his other characters. Over the course of the last few turns, he had a chance to use them to take out some of my dragons or Elsa, but his main hope for lethal was to play them slow, and instead of challenging in or rushing in with Zeus, play them and quest up to 20 if I had no more removal. And so he certainly had the right idea behind that in his game plan. This was a beautiful best of 3, and I'm really glad that I got to play him.
Anything, and then bounce the Zeus back because Franz, it just isn't doesn't have the 3 that he needs. Once the Zeus is gone, Franz only has 2 lore on board, and Steadfast can quest with everything. So man, that third Maleficent coming in actually pretty clutch there. If he didn't have the third Maleficent, I think Franz might have just won that one with both the Cruella and the Maleficent unexerted, and therefore not being able to be removed there.
Yeah, and something going back to talking about just how important decisions are early in the game and how they affect the long game. Aladdin Street Rat was played 2 times this game, meaning that Franz lost 2 lore, so he would have been up at 19. And which could have, were those not played, were the lore not taken away, Franz may have had just enough to place enough things and leave them ready for next turn to be able to squeeze his way by with a victory. It's one of the things that I love about this game is the nuance of just every decision that you make, either as an aggro or a control player, can make or break these games.
Yeah, so B Squared pretty much nailed it on the head there, sort of what I said earlier. The nuances in this game on both sides really resulted in an insane best of 3 that could have easily swung both ways. I'm so happy that I got to see this deck by Franz firsthand because I think the narrative of Amethyst Ruby being unbeatable isn't true at all. He could have taken this best of 3 on another day or even a best of 5 if we had played more matches. Definitely a great tournament game. If you made it this far, thank you so much for sticking around. I hope this video was interesting and useful. Please give everyone involved here a follow. Franz, Traverse Tavern, B Squared, Jeilanin, and Lorcana HQ. And if you want to see more content like this, let me know in the comments below. Drop a like, drop a subscription, join my Discord, all of the good things. And either way, stay tuned and have fun gaming.